Everybody, please be seated. Good morning. Good morning. We are ready to proceed. Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Thank you, Judge.
Your name, sir?
Brandon Fett.
Thank you.
Mr. Fitz, you want to raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give the court and the jury will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Please be seated.
Good morning, sir. Could you please state your name for the record?
Good morning. My name is Brandon Fett.
And Mr. Fitt, what is your occupation?
I'm a realtor with the Real Living Morgan Realty Group.
And where is that? Where is your office located?
It's in Port Clinton on the corner of Jefferson and Perry Street.
Okay. And how long have you been a realtor?
Let's see, since 2011.
Okay. Sir, did you ever have occasion to be involved with a property located at 653 South Lightner Road in Port Clinton, Ohio?
Yes, I did.
And do you recall approximately when you had interaction with that property?
It was when it was listed, April 2nd, I believe, 2014.
Okay. And what was your involvement with that property on that date?
I was called by a client who wanted to see the property. They said they drove past it and saw a for sale sign in the yard. I looked it up on multiple lists, saw that it was just listed, and I called Janine Porter, who was the listing agent on the multiple list, asked for a showing, and subsequently talked to another one of my clients later in that day who said they'd also like to see the property. And I spoke to them, called Janine Porter again and asked for permission to see it.
Okay, were you granted permission?
Yes, I was.
And when you got to the property, well, let me ask you this. When did you show the first individual who had called? When did you show that individual the property?
Well, the first individual that called, I actually showed it to him the following morning, which was April 3rd.
Okay.
The second individual I talked to, I showed it to them actually that evening, April 2nd. It was, I don't know what time, it was in the evening, 7:30ish.
So the second caller saw it first?
Correct.
Okay. And when you got to the property, was there any lockbox?
No, there was not. No, and I was informed that there'd be no lockbox on it, that the back door would be unlocked.
Okay. Did you actually go into the premises?
Yes, I did.
And what was your evaluation of the interior of the premises?
It was full of a lot of stuff, a lot of junk. Trash was piled up. There was a path that you could get through the entire house, but in general, it was pretty cluttered. I mean, beyond cluttered, there was trash, there was garbage in pretty much in every room of the house.
Okay, and you also indicate that you took another client back the next morning, April 3rd?
Correct.
And approximately what time in the morning on April 3rd did you take that client to the premises?
It's about 8:30 in the morning.
Okay. And did you also take that individual into the house?
Yes, I did.
And do you remember that individual's name?
That was Kevin Francis.
Okay. When you were in the house, did you notice, well, let me go back. Prior to showing the house, were there any indications or notices of firearms in the premises?
Yes, when I spoke to Janine Porter, she did tell me that there were guns in the house, which she said that the contents of the house were not to remain with the house.
Okay. Did you, when you got to the house, did you indeed see firearms?
I did see a gun cabinet. I don't remember exactly what was inside the gun cabinet. I do remember seeing an air rifle, BB gun. Besides that, I don't know how many or what was in there.
Okay. Are you able to identify different firearms?
To an extent, I'm not an expert.
would you be able to identify a 12-gauge shotgun?
I can tell a 12-gauge shotgun from an air rifle, from a rifle, yes.
Do you recall seeing a 12-gauge shotgun in the gun cabinet?
I do not recall seeing a 12-gauge shotgun, no.
Okay, and was that both on the evening of April 2nd and the morning of April 3rd?
Yes.
Sir, was the premises in a condition where, had your client wanted to write an offer, that you could have actually conducted business and written that offer in that environment?
Could I have written the offer inside the house?
Yes.
No, I would have probably written it on the hood of my car because there just wasn't enough space on anything to actually write. I mean, I guess I could have cleared something off, but I probably would have done it outside anyhow.
Okay, one moment, sir. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Kraus?
Thank you, Judge. What day did you notice the firearms, sir? April 2nd or April 3rd?
On both days,
Okay. They hadn't been moved or tampered with when you were in the house?
not to my knowledge, no. They were in the same place on April 3rd as they were on April 2nd.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about your experience with firearms.
Sure.
Have you ever fired a 12-gauge shotgun?
Yes, I have.
22 rifles,
Yes.
410s?
I don't think I've ever shot 410.
Okay. So you've had some experience firing guns, but you don't claim to be an expert?
No.
Okay. And listening to you talk and the tone of your voice, I don't get the impression that you're a gun guy per se, that you're into firearms as a hobby?
No, not really.
Okay. So this was not something that attracted a great deal of your attention?
No.
You couldn't put a value on the firearms you saw or tell us what caliber or gauge anything was?
I cannot. Like I said, the only thing that I really recognized was an air rifle.
Thank you, Mr. Fitt. No further questions.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
All right, you may step down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else from the defense?
No further witnesses on behalf of the defense, Your Honor.
Okay, any rebuttal?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
I'm not sure if we've had some exhibits introduced that have not been previously introduced. I know there's some.
Your Honor, I would ask to admit exhibits, I believe just to make sure, I believe it's O through double B. If I could just have a moment to.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, in that.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, O through double B, Your Honor.
Any objections?
No, Your Honor.
That's all.
So we do. Okay, anything else from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, we've now gotten to the point in the trial in which we've heard all of the evidence. You'll have an opportunity at this point in time to hear the closing comments of counsel. I told you in the beginning of the trial that the statements the attorneys make are not evidence, and that includes the closing comments of counsel. The closing comments are the attorneys' opinions of what they think the evidence has already shown. Since the state of Ohio has the burden of proof, the state will go first with respect to its closing comments, the defense will go second, and then the state will have an opportunity, because it has the burden of proof, to have a rebuttal comment. After that, we'll have the final instructions that I'll be giving to you. I know you want to renew your Rule 29 motions?
Yes, sir.
Okay, it'll be over.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. All right, you may proceed.
Thank you, Judge.
Excuse me, could I just have 1 minute?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
I want to thank all of you for the attention you paid to this case. And as a preliminary remark, I want to explain to you, it's a privilege to represent the state of Ohio in matters like this. It really is. I have somebody like Helen Stein, who is not a woman who has a lot of physical possessions, but she can come into court and have the same rights as anybody else and ask for justice. And that's what this case is about. Because if there's one thing we've learned at this point in the trial, this case is about Helen Stein asking for justice. Because somebody took things from her without her permission. At this point, there's no real mysteries left in this case. We all know what happened. We've gone over it over and over and over again with the various witnesses. What the state established with Helen Stein was, first of all, she's currently 67 years old. This happened last year. On April 4th, she was 65 or older, so she's an elderly person. That's relevant in this case because it's an element of the theft charge. And that's a finding you're going to have to make on the jury form if you convict Mr. Kraus of theft. Is you're going to have to find that she's also an elderly person, which we established here. The other thing we put on with Mrs. Stein was she never gave Mr. Kraus permission to go into her house, and she never gave him permission to take her items. The other thing we established in this case when we called the second witness, Roger Peen, was that the defendant was photographed removing items from the house. It's rather hard to argue you didn't take things out of the house when you're photographed in the act of doing it. In this case, he didn't know at the time those photographs were taken because Mr. Peen stayed in his house that he'd been caught.
I'm sorry, could you just...
That he'd been caught. That what he was doing was documented. It wasn't just somebody saying, I remember a guy in a brown truck. It's a picture of the man and a picture of the brown truck and a picture of different items being carried by the man from the house. And Roger Peen also established he had the rear door propped open as he's carrying things in and out. Now, the next witness we called was Clay Steins. We called Clay for some very important reasons. Clay was the transition from Roger Peen because he's the first person in the family to be notified that there's a problem. And he gets the photographs sent to him. He sends them on to Tabitha Loroff, who's at work. Clay Steins is at work when all this is happening. Tabitha Loroff is at work when all this is happening. Initially, you learn from Clay that nobody tells Helen instantly what had happened at her house. However, Tabitha Loroff gets in contact with Janine Porter and tells Janine Porter what had happened. This is not a situation where Janine Porter is confused about what happened a year ago because she never discussed it. Janine Porter knew the day of that Mr. Kraus entered that house and took property without permission. She knew that day from Tabitha Loroff. That's important. What else is important? Well, we called Tabitha Loroff. Ms. Loroff came in here and told you she knew Jeff Berquist, Steve Kraus's employer, the broker that he was a realtor for. And because she had a past relationship with Mr. Berquist, she called him directly and said, hey, this happened. And then she sends him photographs of his employee removing property from a house. At that point, when Mr. Berquist and Mr. Kraus talk, Mr. Kraus knows there's photographs of me taking property out of the house. And this is literally the day of April 4th. Now, why is all this important? Because from April 4th to today, Mr. Kraus had the opportunity to try to explain what happened inside that house and why he did what he did. And we got that explanation yesterday. And it doesn't make sense, ladies and gentlemen. That's the sad part about this case. Janine Porter is very clear. She asked for his help to sell an antique car. The car that we learned from Helen Steins was a 1932 Chevrolet with suicide doors. She never gave him permission to go in the house. She didn't give him permission to auction the contents. She didn't give him permission to take anything from the house. And yet Mr. Kraus comes in here and says, I had an oral contract with Janine Porter and I had a fiduciary responsibility to take things for safekeeping. Really? When you know those items have been in the house for 8 years with no one living in the house, all of a sudden it's an emergency when you want to take things out of the house? And what's the emergency that made it necessary for you to take things out of the house? Well, it was the missing guns. But here's the problem. And it's a big problem. The only gun that was missing was Clay Stein's 12-gauge Winchester double-barreled shotgun that he got from his dad. And that gun was not in the house, according to the defense witnesses, on September 3rd. Now, Mr. Fitt, not a gun guy. I understand this, okay? There are some things that when you're into it, you're into it. However, the chiropractor, Mr. Francis, he is into guns. He looked at the guns. And when he looked at the guns on the morning of September 4th, the only guns he saw were 22 and something else and a bunch of BB guns. Why is that important? Because we got to go back to Clay Stein's. Clay Stein's told you after he learned that the property had been taken from his mother's house by Steve Kraus, he did two things. He went over and put locks on the house immediately, and he got his guns out of the house. He got his .22 Magnum, he got his .410 shotgun, and he got all that out of the house. Do you all realize the enormity of the lie you were told by Mr. Kraus here in court? His justification for taking this property is he's claiming the guns were taken, but they weren't taken until after Clay Stein's learned that his mother's property had been removed. And the only gun he was missing was the 12-gauge shotgun, the double-barrel Winchester. I know some of you caught that. I understand that. This is one of the purposes of closing arguments, to give you my recollection of the facts of the case. Because when we look at this case, we have Mr. Kraus admitting he took stuff out of the house without permission from the owner, but claims he had permission from Janine Porter. He wants to blame Janine Porter for his behavior. There's a problem with that. The problem isn't that Janine Porter's mistaken. Janine Porter is adamant, and she's been adamant all along, that she never gave him permission to go in the house or take anything. Mr. Kraus acknowledged on the stand that he's accusing Janine Porter of lying. And you realize, in some respects, this is a credibility case between Janine Porter and Stephen Kraus. They both can't be telling you the truth here. Okay? How do you handle that situation? You look at normal things. Who had the motive to lie here? Janine Porter? What's her motive to lie? It's very apparent from her testimony she belongs to the same party as Mr. Kraus. They were attending the same campaign functions. This isn't politics on her part. What you have here is a woman who's passionate about her job and protects her clients. Who was willing to come into court and tell you what happened, even though people didn't necessarily want her to do that. On the other side, you have Mr. Kraus, who's trying to explain something that's unexplainable, which is, do you really believe that he had permission to pick what he wanted to buy without ever discussing it with the owner, without ever discussing price, without ever leaving an inventory or talking about what was taken, and just load it up and put it in his truck because he's Steve Kraus? Or do you believe there's something else going on here? Which is Mr. Kraus found out about a house on a rural road that contained antiques. And he went over with his truck, scouted the place, came back the next day, loaded up his boxes and left. And nothing was said to anybody until he learned he'd been caught in the act. And everything else after that was a bunch of stories. Because let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen, if he was really motivated to protect Helen Stein's interests, to protect her property, because he concluded a thief had been in the house, because the guns that Clay Stein recovered later that day were in fact missing, if you think the thief's stolen things, why do you take things from the house? That's the first point. Second point is, if you can't get a hold of Helen Stein to tell Helen Stein firearms are missing, why don't you call the Ottawa County Sheriff? Or the Danbury Police Department to say, hey, there's guns missing. We all know how dangerous firearms can be in the wrong hands. We know that. And why do you only take the things you want to protect them? Are you really protecting Helen Stein at that point, or are you protecting yourself? And when you think of all this stuff, all of a sudden, you realize what really happened here. We have a guy who got caught in the act, didn't know it, and ever since has been trying to justify his behavior. And yesterday you got to hear his side of the story, and it doesn't make sense. I'm going to take your property for your own benefit. I'm not going to tell you about it, but hey, it was an emergency because there's a thief in the house. Contrast that story with what happened when he met with Tabitha Laurel on September 5th. On September 5th, he was apologetic. He was admitting he was wrong. I'm a Christian. I don't do things this way. And all the rest of that story as he hands her a box and leaves. Contrast his description of those events with what Tabitha Laurel told you. What does Tabitha Laurel have to gain from this? Same with her boyfriend Clay. Didn't want to be involved. Then you understand what's really driving this case. We got Helen Steins saying, I don't want to be a victim. I don't want people taking things that belong to my family, that have been in my family's possession for 100 years. That's important. Because now you understand this isn't a secret conspiracy. This is a 67-year-old lady who came to you for justice. And you never would have found that out until you sat on this jury. So what am I required to prove here, since I do have the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, the first thing I have to prove is identity. I have to prove it's this man here. There's no dispute about that, ladies and gentlemen. None. Mr. Kraus admitted he was at the house. Mr. Kraus acknowledged he took property. So we've met the identification issue on both the breaking and entering count and the theft account. What else do I have to prove? I have to prove Helen Steins is over 65, we've done that. On the theft, I also have to prove he took property without the consent of the owner. We've done that as well. Here's the important point about taking the property. Once you take it, the crime's been completed. The fact that you find out later that day you were photographed doing it doesn't make you innocent. Okay? The fact that people call and complain to your boss and you realize you're in trouble doesn't mean you didn't commit the act earlier that day. What we have here is the crime being committed and then somebody trying to work his way out of it. Okay? What about the breaking and entering count? Well, we're not proceeding on burglary at this point. We're proceeding only on the breaking and entering. And what we have to do is determine, is this a building? You got pictures of it. It's a house. It's got doors, it's got windows, it's a building. Did he go into this unoccupied structure and commit a crime, which in this case is theft? And the answer to that, again, is pretty easy. Yeah. If you believe Helen Steins and Janine Porter, he never had permission. His entry into this home is a trespass. Just that simple. If you go where you're not, belongs to somebody else, it's a building, you go inside without permission, you're trespassing. If you commit an additional crime inside that building, in this case theft, taking property belonging to somebody else, without permission, well, then it's breaking and entering. So when you go back there, and you look at the elements, you're going to realize this is actually a simple case. We spent a lot of time talking about things that were background in this case to clarify things for you. I mean, why Helen Steins had to sell her house isn't necessarily relevant, but it explains who she is, how she met Janine Porter, why the decision-making process happened the way it did. So we put it into evidence to complete the story so you would understand from a human level why people were doing what they were doing back in April. So what are we really left with? We're left with a kind of tawdry crime. Kind of pathetic, really. You got a grown man who's got a professional position who nonetheless went into a house without permission and took things. Then he got caught. And then he has to try to lie his way out of it. Has to come up with justifications that make sense, although they don't. They're inconsistent. They don't match the facts. And they don't even match what his own witnesses have to say. Because understand something. Mr. Francis and Mr. Pitt, they were both witnesses that appeared literally in the middle of the trial. You know that at this point. You learned that yesterday when Mr. Francis testified.
I'm sorry.
You learned that yesterday when Mr. Francis testified. But the thing is, they didn't help the defendant. Their explanation and discussion of the firearms matches what Clay Steins told you. And you're left with only one conclusion. On the morning of the 4th, those guns were in the house until Clay Steins took them out that night when he got home. If that's true, he didn't have any justification for taking anything. He wasn't protecting anybody from a thief. He was the thief. And the other thing you learned is that he was in the house on September 3rd. His witnesses never saw the 12-gauge shotgun. Clay Steins thought it was there, but his witnesses didn't see it till the 4th. Now, that's right. We don't know if he walked out of there with that shotgun on the 3rd, do we? Is he charged with stealing the shotgun? No. The victim on the case, in this case for the theft, is Helen Steins and only Helen Steins. But the shotgun is important because that's where his case fell apart. That's where the lie didn't work anymore, ladies and gentlemen. That's where he tripped himself up. He tried too hard to tell a complete story, and he screwed it up. You all know it. That's why you have to find him guilty, ladies and gentlemen, because he did it. And there aren't any doubts left in this case at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Similar to what the prosecutor mentioned, I do sincerely appreciate all of your time and efforts. Sitting as a member of a jury is by no means a fun event, nor is it an easy event. So in the same context in which the prosecutor expressed that, I would also like to express my appreciation for your time and your efforts in being here today. I thank you for that sincerely. Ladies and gentlemen, you have, as being jury members, kind of gone back to your early childhood for story time. And in school, or if you went to the library, there were little groups and you'd sit down and you'd listen to a story. Sometimes those were fictional stories where everything was made up. And sometimes those were non-fictional stories where everything was fact-based and true. I proffer to you that the state and I each told you a story. I would also tell you that as to who told you the non-fictional story, that was the defense through Mr. Kraus. This incident starts with the fact that Janine Porter testified that Helen Steins needed money. I'm going to move this so I don't have to move back so far. Helen Steins needed money. She needed money, but she recommended the least valuable option, which was to sell it only for land value. Despite the fact Helen Steins testified that the structure of the house was good. So she needed money. Your realtor has a fiduciary duty to get you the most money. Yet this realtor said, let's just sell it for land value, despite the fact we have a, in her own client's words, structurally sound structure. We get to this incident where it's alleged that Mr. Kraus took things. He never denied that. He's always acknowledged that. He even told you that he took things in his testimony that the state nor any of the witnesses told you about. And I won't go into a lot of that, but there was testimony about a motorcycle helmet. No witness ever told you about a motorcycle helmet. The state never mentioned a motorcycle helmet. He told you about a motorcycle helmet. Why? Because he's not hiding anything. Mr. Kraus has been an auctioneer for 11 years. 11 years during which he's never had anyone file any complaint, raise any issue with him. In fact, his reputation was so good that it was at the continuing education class that Miss Porter came up to Mr. Kraus. She wouldn't have come up to him if she didn't trust him. She even acknowledged that when she received the phone call that Steve had taken things out of the house, that she said, I don't believe it. I'd have to see the pictures myself before I do. That was her perception of Steve Kraus, that he was that upstanding that he would never do that. And he had never in 11 years been accused of doing that. That's why she went to him. There's testimony that Steve was taking these items for what? To get rich? He took a couple boxes of things to get rich? Why is the state's story fictional? Because everybody told you something different. The first two people that the officer spoke to were Helen Steins and Tabitha Loroff. And they testified here themselves. And there were many inconsistencies between what they say and what Officer Meisler said when he testified about his report. Helen Steins originally pointed at Tabitha Loroff and said, she's the one that knows everything. She's the one that told me everything I know. Tabitha Loroff then says, all the information I have, I got from Helen Steins. Now we heard the officer testify that his report was in an early stage every time I brought up a discrepancy. And it wasn't until I asked him, well, when did this stage end, that it ended, ironically, on the date that I was questioning him about. That people need to go back and do further discussion with other people. Officer Meisler didn't talk to Tabitha Loroff until 26 days after the incident occurred. 26 days. The family member testified that the day they received the offer, they all met in the house to discuss it. They were there. They were there and the items were already gone. You can't tell me they didn't sit there and discuss it. That they didn't sit there and figure out the story. That they didn't know who actually saw it and who told who what they didn't see. They talked about it that day. Yet the officer would have you believe that 26 days later, they still hadn't talked about it. This was a family homestead that they loved. And allegedly, without permission, somebody took stuff. You don't think they would have talked about it before 4 weeks passed? It's not plausible. It's made up. We also heard initially that there, according to Helen Stein's property lists, that there were die-cast cars that were never returned. Yet Clay Steins, who said those were his cars, acknowledged they were still there. We also heard that there were other people in the home. Tabitha Loroff testified that she was at the property without Helen Stein's knowledge, and that she cleaned off the front porch and threw things away without the homeowner knowing. What did she throw away? We don't know. Was it potentially some of the items that are missing? We don't know that either. But the only person who disposed of property were individuals other than Steve Kraus. There was a room full of empty beer cans, stacked 3 feet high. Now I assure you, Mr. Kraus testified he was there for an hour on April 3rd and 2 hours on April 4th. I'm Irish. I have a drink once in a while, but I can't drink 3 feet high worth of beer cans in 3 hours. There were other people in that property. Helen Steins didn't live there. She wasn't even in the same state for 5 years. Other people would go there, and she acknowledged that. Other people were checking on the house. What were they doing there? She doesn't know. She has no idea. There was bad blood in this family. Anything could have been happening. Who else was there? We had testimony from Brandon Fitt, the realtor, as well as Kevin Francis, who was the second individual that Mr. Fitt took into the home on the morning of April 3rd, 2014. Brandon Fitt had been in the house twice. The evening of April 2nd, which was the first day the house was listed, and again the next morning at 8:30 with Mr. Francis. Both of these incidents occurred before Steve Kraus was ever even at the property. Steve Kraus, pursuant to the evidence presented in this case, didn't get to the house until 1:30 on April 3rd, 5 hours after Mr. Fitt had already been there twice. And what did you hear? You heard Mr. Fitt testify, and you heard Mr. Francis testify that there was no 12-gauge shotgun in that cabinet. Why is that significant? Because as the state said, they're not charging Mr. Kraus with taking the gun, but they said it's a very crucial point in this case where his story fell apart. Well, if they're not accusing him of taking the gun, why was there so much questioning of whether or not it was possible for him to break down the gun and put it in an 18-inch box? Because I had questioned, did any of those photos show him taking a gun? Clearly not. Those photos showed every trip he made. That was the testimony. Didn't take a gun. The state said, was it possible he broke it down? They're accusing him of taking everything. It's crucial because they can't show that he took anything. He admits what he took. He admits what he brought back. He told you why he did it. There were other people in the house. There were items missing. Steve Kraus was not the only person in this house. We get down to this investigation. An investigation over what the state just told you is a fairly simple case. A simple case that took over 7 months to investigate. A simple case where we would go weeks at a time without any further investigation on the matter. Why? Because for reasons such as Mr. Kraus gave Tabitha Loroff a business card, but that wasn't trustworthy enough to pursue. Instead, I pursued a verbal comment by somebody else. The investigation was closed. Strike that. The investigation portion was closed and referred to the prosecutor's office in July of 2014. We don't know of anything that happened for the next 3 months. To the day from July 13th to October 13th, there appears to be nothing done with this case. Now, October 13th, about 3 weeks before election time, this case gets reopened. Why? Because, as the officer stated, he had direction from the prosecutor, a prosecutor who wasn't yet appointed on the case. Mr. Kraus wins the election November 5th, 2014. Mr. Kraus is indicted November 19th, 2014, 15 days after he won election. Now, we couldn't bring this case to be charged within the first 6.5 months. But after his election, we got it done in 15 days. The state would like you to believe that Janine Porter didn't give, in essence, anyone permission to enter the house. You heard him question Kevin Francis yesterday several times about, you didn't have permission to be there, did you? He would say, yes, my realtor said I did. When you use a realtor, that's why you use a realtor. Realtors are precluded from personally contacting the other realtor's client. So Mr. Francis can't call Janine Porter directly. Brandon Fitt can't call Helen Steins directly. It's not permitted within their profession. It's no different than lawyers. I can't talk to the other lawyer's witness, and he can't talk to my witness, or my client. It's the same thing.
Yet everything's portrayed that nobody had authority to be there. Now think about that. Janine Porter was given authority to handle the disposition of the single largest asset that Helen Steins owned. Yet she didn't give anyone authority to be there? How was she going to sell it? You heard Steve Kraus testify. I want you to take note that he sat there and he told you his story. There was no prompting other than what happened next. He told you his story. He never veered from that story. He was never inconsistent in that story. Everything he told you was exactly as we've always indicated it would be. And there was no line of questioning from the prosecutor that was able to penetrate and break down his non-fictional story, his fact and truth-based account of what happened on those 3 days. The state told you in their closing arguments that it's hard to argue. It's hard for Mr. Kraus to argue that he didn't take things out of the house. He never did argue he didn't take things out of the house. He's always said he took the things. He's been up front. He's been honest. There was an oral contract, which is permitted in the state of Ohio. There's a fiduciary duty between Ms. Steins, Ms. Porter and her client, Ms. Steins. As a realtor and auctioneer himself, once his services are engaged, that fiduciary duty extends to him as well. He cannot go on the property at the direction of the listing agent, and if he sees something wrong, when he's there for the benefit of the homeowner, ignore it. He would be violating his ethical duties. He would be violating his duty to protect the homeowner. The state, again, wants to make an issue with the fact that the only gun that was missing was a 12 gauge. That's not true. That's true when Mr. Fitt and Mr. Francis went through the house, which was before Mr. Kraus was there. Yes, that is true. At that time, nobody saw a 12 gauge. But when Mr. Kraus went back on April 4th, all the guns were missing. And he was so devious, and he was trying to cover everything up, that he tried to call immediately Janine Porter 3 times. You heard her testify to that. My phone rang 3 times, but I couldn't answer because the weather was terrible. I couldn't answer the phone because I couldn't drive and talk on the phone in those conditions. Steve Kraus was trying to be so discreet that he thought the best thing to do would be to call somebody immediately. Call the listing agent with whom he had the coexisting fiduciary duty. A responsible reaction. The state told you that's where the case broke down, that it broke down at the 12 gauge shotgun. How did it break down at the 12 gauge shotgun when that gun was missing before Mr. Kraus ever got there? It doesn't make sense. The state would have you believe that Mr. Kraus only returned the items once he found out that someone knew he took them. He called Janine Porter to tell her he was taking them. In fact, you heard testimony from Janine Porter and Steve Kraus that he called and said, "There's guns missing from the house." And the response was, "Yes, I know, the son took them." He took them that day. They were there, according to Mr. Fitt, Mr. Francis, and Mr. Kraus, on the 3rd. They weren't there on the 4th. Janine Porter's statement
regarding the son took them validates Mr. Kraus's statement that they were gone. He didn't talk to the son. He didn't know who took them. He just knew they were gone. And Ms. Porter verified that that was actually the case. Mr. Kraus was also so discreet that he immediately took the items back before he knew that there were photos. He didn't know there were photos when he took the items back. He took them back at approximately 3:30 or 4 o'clock that day, and pursuant to the testimony of Tabitha Loroff, Jeff Berquist, the conversation about photos didn't happen until 8:30 that night. He wasn't worried about if somebody had photos because he called Janine Porter earlier that day and said, I took this stuff. He wasn't worried about it, and he wasn't hiding anything. He told her. The state says that this case comes down to a credibility issue. That's correct. The state says, what was Janine Porter's incentive to lie? The state would have you believe there wasn't one. The state says, well, what was Janine Porter's incentive to lie? That, as we've heard, she gave Mr. Kraus permission to enter the house. Mrs. Steins took the stand and said, in her initial contact, as verified in his report, that her realtor may have inadvertently given permission to an unknown male to enter the premises. Maybe she didn't have that authority from her client, but that's what she said to Mr. Kraus. That's what she said in her capacity as a realtor who represented Helen Steins, a realtor who had the authority, as every realtor does, to allow people to enter the house for purposes of sale or purposes of inspection. She told Mr. Kraus he could be there, and he was. The state wants to make an issue. They told you that Steve said nothing to anyone and that he wasn't going to tell anyone about it. 3 phone calls to the listing agent as he was at the property is not going to tell anyone? Instantaneous attempts to contact the listing agent is being quiet and not telling anyone? I would think not. Steve never admitted, as the state would have you believe, that he told Tabitha Loroff that what he did was wrong. Tabitha Loroff told you that's what he said. What else did Tabitha Loroff tell you? Tabitha Loroff told you it was a sunny day. Tabitha Loroff told you it was sunny and therefore there was no reason to need to take any items outside of the premises to look at them elsewhere in a better light. However, when I showed Tabitha Loroff the pictures taken by Roger Peen of Mr. Kraus taking the items out, quickly her version of the stories was found to be a lie. It was rainy, it was gray, it was dreary, it was miserable. One moment. The state would also have you believe, and they tried to make an issue with the fact that Steve Kraus didn't call the police. Janine Porter knew about the same incident a half hour later when Steve Kraus got to his driveway and called her for a 4th time. She knew at approximately 4 or 4:30 on April 4th that Steve believed that things were missing. Now, she knew why the guns were missing. But now she believes that Steve Kraus, according to her testimony now, that he took things without permission. Why didn't she call the police? If one party should call the police about a theft, it's only fair to hold the same other people to the same standard. What was Steve's incentive to take the items? Steve's incentive to take the items would have been because if he was caught, he would lose his realtor's license. Because if he was caught, he'd lose his auctioneer's license. He'd lose his ability to make a living. He'd lose the ability to make a living as he had done for 11 years. I remind you, he wasn't an elected official at that time. There was no other income. And even the elected official capacity only lasts until the voters say it doesn't. But as of April 2014, that was his only means of making money. And he would risk that over a cardboard box full of stuff? Where are we in this case? There's three things. The testimony of two people that really shed light on this case. I'm sorry, three people. Helen Steins. Helen Steins initially said that her realtor may have inadvertently given an unknown male permission to enter the residence. That would support Steve Kraus's non-fictional version of the events. Clay Stein's testimony is perhaps the most telling. Clay Stein's, when he testified on Wednesday, indicated that he had received text message from Roger Peen indicating that someone was at the house. Clay responded. And he said that someone was there and was supposed to look at some antiques and an antique car. Not just a car. What's more telling? When Clay Steins said here on this stand, under oath to tell the truth, the prosecutor asked him, did you know what was specifically supposed to be looked at? Clay Stein's response, just antiques my mom had in the house. That was his answer. He knew someone was allowed to be in the house. He knew that person was allowed to look at antiques in the house. And that's what he told you sitting in that chair. That's what he told you sitting in that chair. That I was at the house to look at antiques. There's no inconsistency there. Finally, when questioned, Ms. Porter indicated that she had told Mr. Kraus's prior attorney, Jim Hart, that she believed that what Steve Kraus did, he did only in an effort to help. Why is that important? Well, that's important because there has to be an intent to deprive the homeowner of the property. He didn't intend to deprive her of the property. He intended to maintain the security of the property temporarily. He didn't intend to keep it. Never once has anyone been able to say otherwise. He only took it back when there were pictures. That's wrong. He took it back before. He didn't tell anyone. That's wrong. He called Janine Porter 3 times, and then again a 4th time a half hour later, immediately when he did it. He wasn't intending to deprive anybody of something secretly. He was only intending to carry out his professional obligation within the scope of his fiduciary duty pursuant to an oral contract he had with the listing agent to protect that property. And once he knew that the son had taken the stuff out, he took back those items and simply, as he had indicated, kept the rest until he returned those to Tabitha Loroff the next day. He took the items back that he didn't have a fiduciary duty over, and he kept hold of the others until he got Tabitha Loroff the next day. And he was so discreet, he said, "I'm Steve Kraus, here's my business card." He could have given it to her and driven away. We don't know if she knew his name at that point. He wasn't hiding anything from anyone, folks. He wasn't hiding anything from anyone, and that was nobody's version of the story until 15 days after he was elected. Folks, again, I want to thank you for being here. Now the state gets another opportunity to talk to you. I do not. So I'd ask you to remember and consider, as I know you all will, what I've told you here today, based on what we've presented to you over the last 2.5 days. And I again thank you for your service, and I'm confident that when this matter is left in your hands, you will understand what Mr. Kraus was doing, and that he had no ill will, no intent, that he was forthright with everyone. His story didn't change. And that you'll come back and find him not guilty of the only 2 counts that remain. You originally told you were going to have 3, and the state didn't meet the burden on the 1. So I thank you. I'd ask you to come back, find Mr. Kraus not guilty, as I believe the evidence shows. And again, thank you for your time.
Mr. Braun.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let's deal with some things first, right off the top. If this was really all about the election, wouldn't they have indicted him before the election? Really? Come on. It's not what it was about. Janine Porter. We have to go back to Janine. He says that she said something. That she had told Jim Hart his intentions were good. Well, there's a problem with that. Because that's not what she said on the stand. And no one ever contradicted what she said on the stand. So that's not evidence of anything. It is merely what it is. It's a suggestion. You might have said something at a different date, and the person said, no, I didn't. And that doesn't prove Mr. Kraus had good intentions here. What else do we have? The claim that he must be innocent because he tried to call Janine Porter 3 times. I don't have a problem with that. Janine Porter was in the middle of a terrible thunderstorm and she did not answer the phone. You're supposed to exonerate this man based on phone calls that never happened. He dials a number, he never has a conversation. He's asking you to speculate at that point that there was something that would clear his client. Let's go over the order very carefully. Those phone calls are made, she doesn't answer the phone, then she hears from Tabitha Loroff, sees the picture, and then she talks to this man. And it's at that point she knows he's taken property out of the house without permission, and he's done it to one of her clients. And that's why they had that curt phone call. That's why she doesn't want him to put his arm around her at the Republican function on April 23rd. And that's why he shows up at the table she's sitting at a political event later on. And when he puts his hat down and tries to sit down next to her, she tells him, get out of here, I'll kick your ass. Then I'll go up to that microphone and tell everybody you're a thief. Does that sound like a woman who's confused? Or does that sound like somebody who's angry because he victimized her client? And you ever heard Steve Kraus deny that happened? Mr. Murphy spent an enormous amount of time yesterday trying to get Sergeant Niesler to trip up while he was on the stand going over his police reports. But what really happened here? Well, it was early in the investigation. What he's telling him is, look, when Helen Steins comes into me and I make an initial report, the only person I've talked to is Helen Steins. I haven't talked to Roger Peen yet. How do you know Roger Peen was involved? Haven't talked to Tabitha Laura, haven't talked to Clay Steins, haven't talked to Janine Porter. And this person is coming into me saying, this might have happened. That's why we do investigations. So we find out what really happened, not what somebody thinks might have happened. That doesn't mean people were lying or changing their story. That means Detective Niesler did his job. And while you might hear the defense complain about how long the investigation took, you're not hearing him complain about the thoroughness of the investigation, ladies and gentlemen. Because when you get right down to it, we proved this case based on that investigation. Where are the other alleged holes? If I confuse Mr. Murphy, that's my fault. Okay? When I talk about the guns being the case where his case breaks down, I'm talking about the guns Clay Stein removed from his house after he found out from Roger Peen that somebody was taking property out of the house. Because when he went in the house, his 12-gauge shotgun was gone. And once one of your guns is gone, you're worried somebody's going to come back and get the rest. So what did he do? He gathered it all up and he took it home. Only that's not what Stevie Kraus testified to. Kraus's motive, allegedly, for safekeeping the property remains. Somebody stole the guns and I thought there was a thief, so I took custody of all this stuff before I ever talked to anybody who had the ability to make a decision over this property. Kraus's world, Helen Steins didn't get a voice in what he took and what he didn't take. Nobody consulted her about what she wanted to sell or the sale of an antique car. How much work did he put into selling an antique car? Not much. There's a huge difference between the items that were removed from the house and the antique car. You can't load the antique car up in boxes and put it in your truck and drive away. It's too damn big. Took the stuff he could take. Why risk your licenses? Why do people do stupid things? I don't know. I can tell you this much. I've been a prosecutor for 26 years in my career as a lawyer, and I've been a lawyer for 28. He's not the first or the last person I've ever seen do something stupid. All you have to do is read the paper somewhere. You'll see the same damn thing. Why do people get arrogant? Why do people think they can get away with things? Why do people try to take advantage of elderly people? I don't know, but they do. And that's what happened here. I truly wish it didn't happen, but it did. And now he has to face the consequences of what he did. Let's talk a little bit about Janine Porter's credibility. The defense has chosen to attack her as a realtor. Mr. Kraus claims he could have gotten this woman more money for her property. In fact, he called his boss to tell you the same information. Yeah, in a theoretical universe, maybe. Because we heard Jeff Berquist's explanation about that. If this property got zoned commercial, then it would be worth this. Only it wasn't zoned commercial. They had some frontage, but the property's surrounded by other family members. If you're Clay Steins, do you want your mom putting a gas station in next to your house? Or if you're David Heinzel, do you want a quick mark going in across from your house? Wait a minute, we don't talk about that. We're just in that area of theoretical. There's the human side to this as well. What we had here is a woman who had to sell her house before the sheriff did. The realtor knew it, knew time was of the essence, knew what the property was worth, knew Helen Steins didn't have the time or money to invest to make the property more saleable. And under the circumstances, she discussed these options with her client, and they did what they had to do. Fortunately for the family, David Heinzel stepped up and purchased the property at her very close to her asking price. And the matter's concluded. Does that really sound like Janine Porter doesn't know what she's doing as a realtor? Because that's what you're getting from this side over here. They have to attack Janine Porter because Janine Porter was very, very clear here about what happened. And again, what are the reasons Janine Porter have to lie? Well, guess what? The other option he comes up with was maybe she didn't tell her client the whole truth. Maybe she told Steve he could go in the house, but she never told Helen that, and Steve relied on what Janine said. It's funny. You hear this stuff in closing arguments, but no one ever asked Janine Porter those questions. And Janine Porter was very clear over what her instructions were from her client and what she told Steve Kraus. Doesn't make sense. And when we talk about Tabitha Loroff getting the weather wrong, yeah, she did. But there's a huge difference between remembering what the weather was like on April 4th and remembering your conversation with a guy who got caught in the act of stealing from your boyfriend's mother's house next door on April 5th. You know? I'm going to be honest with you. I've been so focused on this trial, I can't tell you what the weather was like on Wednesday when we started. I don't know. Okay? I don't know. But I can tell you what people said in this courtroom, because that's what I was paying attention to. I want to go back to something Mr. Kraus talked about. His shifting roles here. He goes into the house on the 3rd as a realtor. He enters the house on the 4th as an auctioneer. He returns on the 5th carrying a box of stuff. He knew by the end of the 4th the property was going to be sold to David Heinzel. He knew by that date that stuff was remaining in the family. And he knew by this date that I was called. It's a terrible position for somebody to be in. I'm sure there was a lot of emotional and mental agony that went into this. No doubt about it. Nobody likes to be exposed when you've had the kind of reputation Mr. Kraus had. Nobody likes it when somebody shows the hidden side of your personality that nobody was supposed to see. Because what this case is really about is what did Stephen Kraus do when he didn't think anybody was watching him? When he didn't think he was out in public? When he thought he was in a cluttered old farmhouse that was so cluttered no one would miss anything because you couldn't tell from the mess. up boxes, took things, found out from Janine Porter that he was being accused of theft, gets rid of some of it right away, goes back. Roger Peen told you that. He pulled in, went in the house with one box and left. But there's something else Roger Peen told you that's very important when it comes to boxes. Mr. Murphy was wrong. Roger Peen did not photograph every box being removed from the house. And he told you that. He photographed the last couple trips, but not the first one he saw. And he really doesn't know when it started either, because he didn't see him pull in. But what he was certain about is he saw him take out 4 boxes of stuff. Tabitha Loroff got 1 box back. We know the Victrola came back. We know the saxophone came back. Roger Peen does not confirm that all the property was taken. In fact, it kind of suggests the exact opposite about it being returned, doesn't it? But I have to go back to the last point. Clay Steins is adamant. He got home on the 4th. He had learned from Roger Peen that property was being taken from his mom's house. He goes over, he checks. He finds out his 12-gauge shotgun is missing, and he takes all his guns home. That's after this man's been in the house, after he's removed property. His firearms are still in the house with the exception of the 12-gauge. That's the point I'm trying to make. The other weapons are still there, and he takes them home. His alleged justification for removing property is a lie. That's the point. And if he's lying about it, there's not much more we have to talk about, is there? Then you know what his real intentions were. Because here's the thing. Is the defense suggesting that Mr. Fitt or Mr. Francis stole all the guns out of the gun cabinet and then came back secretly and returned them in the interval of time between when he left and when Roger Peen checked his mother's property? Because if everybody's telling you the truth here, that's what had to have happened. And that story is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. There's nothing to support it. And I hope all of you see this clearly at this point, because this is extraordinarily important. You know, when I caught the defendant saying this on the stand yesterday during cross-examination, I went over it with him. I gave him a chance to explain it. He couldn't recall that testimony from Clay Stein. He could only recall Clay Stein's testimony when he was being asked questions by his lawyer, not me. And you all saw that happen too. He knows he screwed up. He knows he screwed up on April 4th, and he knows he screwed up yesterday. His last chance is you guys. It's up to you. It's not up to anybody else. It's not up to the judge. It's not up to me. It's not up to the defense. This is where you take responsibility for your decisions. So when you go back there, I can't tell you what to do. I can't advise you. I can't tell you what evidence to focus on. What I can tell you is, when we're talking about the credibility of Janine Porter, they never laid a glove on her. They tried, and they couldn't do it. And this is a woman who stood up to Steve Kraus, who went to the Republican Party about Mr. Kraus after she learned what he had done, and who was not going to tolerate him trying to hide behind her and make it appear that, oh, everything was okay at Republican functions. Because she knew. And she brought that information into court, and she shared it with you. So what are we really talking about here? We've got a guilty man who does not want to accept the consequences of his behavior, who's telling you lies. It's not the first time it happened. It's not going to be the last. The guns are not the property we're talking about. We're talking about what was taken from Hellenstein. But the guns were in Hellenstein's house. And Mr. Murphy never directly responded to this line of argument for a reason. There's nothing he can say, ladies and gentlemen. And at this point, you're the only ones who can say something about it. And that's why I would urge you to do your duty and find Steve Kraus guilty of taking property from an elderly woman and of going into her house, an unoccupied structure, without her consent and committing a crime. Because that's what we're talking about here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braun. By the way, it was a beautiful day on Wednesday, and Thursday, and today, and Saturday, and Sunday. Let's go ahead and take a short restroom break. Be back here in, let's say, 20 up. Remember the admonition at this point in time. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Everybody else will see you back in 15 minutes.